Paul Harrell, weekdays from 4 to 6. Learn more at paulharrell.com.
I want to welcome back to the program. We've got former State Representative Charles Fuqua is with us. Charles, welcome back to the program, sir.
I am glad to be here, Paul.
Yes, sir.
Hey, can I start out by kind of introducing myself to your audience?
Absolutely. You are. Yeah, go ahead. Tell them you're the chair of the Independence County Republican Party.
I am that. I am also a retired attorney. I have been a business law professor, and as you said, a member of the Arkansas legislature. And my most recent employment was that I was with the Office of Chief Counsel with the state of Arkansas. And the reason I like talking on programs like this is that I wrote a book. And the name of the book is God's Law, the Only Political Solution. And what that's all about is that I believe that when God gave his law to the nation of Israel, that he gave a law not merely for the nation of Israel, but for the world. And I'm talking about the Ten Commandments. And when he gave that, he told the people of Israel, if you will obey this law, all kinds of blessings will overtake you. But if you disobey this law, curses will overtake you. And I believe that's true. And by the way, our founding fathers believed that was true for Israel and every other nation in all history. And the reason America or the United States has been the most prosperous nation in the world is that we have followed that law more closely than any other nation in all of history. But we are turning away from God's law, and now the curses are coming upon our nation.
Well, certainly in terms of how corrupt our government's getting, I mean, that certainly isn't consistent. That certainly isn't consistent with a biblical worldview. Some of the actions of our leaders that are supposed to represent us, you're certainly right about that. Folks, we're talking with Charles Fuqua. Now, Charles, the reason I want to have you on the program, and I appreciate that introduction, is because you are the Independence County Republican chair. We had you on a couple of months ago, or I don't know, I feel like I can't ever really feel how much time has gone by. It's strange sometimes. But we did have you on recently. And I understand that the Independence County Republican Party, you guys had a meeting this week, and you gave a presentation on the Federal Reserve System. Is that correct?
That's correct. And most people have no understanding of how money comes into existence in the United States. And I'd like to explain and go through that process for your audience so it could be understood. And I'd like to start with a quote from President John Adams, because the economic problems we're experiencing are not new. And here's that quote from John Adams. All the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America rise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, not from want of honor or virtue, so much as from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. Now, he wrote that that was President John Adams. He wrote that in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1787. And so what I'd like to go through today is to explain that system, its origins, and what effect it has today. May I do that?
Absolutely. And I will just say, I love the part in that quote where he says, talks about, hey, that doesn't mean that the Constitution's deficient. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We can keep going back to that old worn-out doctrine, as the liberals call it, or document, and somehow it's always got the answers, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely
It does. Okay. Now, to go back and explain this system, I'm going to start with a couple of scripture quotes from the book of Revelation. That may seem like a strange place to start, but I think it'll make sense as I go along.
Okay.
And here is the first one. It's from Revelation 14:8. Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And then I'm going to read Revelation 17:5. And upon her forehead was written a name, Mystery Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now, what is this mysterious Babylonian harlot? Well, that's what I want to explain today. And to do that, I've got to take us back for a trip to ancient Babylon. And I'm going to explain how the Babylonian grain bank operated. In ancient Babylon...
Now, let me stop you there. Now, this is interesting to me. So you're talking about, you said a bank of grain, meaning like wheat.
Wheat, exactly.
Okay. All
Wheat
right, keep
is
going.
the grain we're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, in Babylon, there was a grain bank, because at times they had excess grain, and they would store it at the grain bank. The grain banker would take the grain in, and he would issue them a receipt for the grain, a CD, or certificate of deposit. Now, in Babylon, the money or medium of exchange was grain. That's what they used as a medium of exchange. So if you wanted to buy a pair of shoes, you took the appropriate amount of wheat to the shoemaker, and he made you a pair of shoes, and you gave him grain. It was the medium of exchange. Well, as I said, people would deposit excess grain in the grain bank, and he would issue them a receipt. Over time, the tendency developed that when you wanted to spend your grain, rather than take the receipt back and give it to the grain banker, you would simply spend the receipt. The receipt began to circulate as if it were the money. Now remember, it's not the money or medium of exchange, the grain is, but the receipt circulated throughout the Babylonian economy as if they were the money or medium of exchange.
Okay.
Now, the grain banker would also at times loan out grain to people. He'd say lend out 10 bushels in the spring to plant your grain, and at harvest time you'd have to pay him back 11 bushels. He'd earn a little interest off his grain. Or he might lend grain to people because they needed it to eat, and at some later date they had to pay him back with interest. Now, one day, somebody came to the Babylonian grain banker and wanted to borrow some grain. But the grain banker didn't have any grain to loan out because all the grain he had already had a receipt issued against it. So all he had was other people's grain. But this person that wanted to borrow the grain said, you know, I don't want this grain to eat, and I don't want the grain to plant. I want to spend the grain. So rather than actually give me the grain, could you simply give me a receipt for the grain? And at that point, the Babylonian grain banker said, you know, that grain just sits there. People continually spend my receipts. Who would know if I had more receipts outstanding for grain than I have grain? And so he just sat down and he wrote out a receipt for grain, and he loaned that receipt into existence and then demanded that he be paid back with interest. Now, I want you to think about what he did. Now, you know, the name of my book is God's Law, the Only Political Solution, and I believe we ought to obey the Ten Commandments. And I believe that by what he did, he violated 2 of the Ten Commandments. First of all, he violated the commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness, because that receipt was a promise to pay grain. But when he issued 2 receipts against 1 unit of grain, he could no longer keep his promise.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, if everybody that held receipts came to the grain bank to claim their grain, what do we call that?
A run on the grain bank.
It's a run on the bank, right? Okay, and it's because he was dishonest. It was because he made a false promise. I would also argue that what he did was stealing, because what he did as he issued more and more receipts, he inflated or expanded the money supply. And as he did that, the money that people held became worth less and less as he expanded the money supply.
Yeah.
So in effect, he was stealing from everyone who had savings. And because what he created was a debt loaned into existence, he was also laying more debt on future generations. Now that system, and if you follow people that study economics, they will tell you that was the origin of what is known today as fractional reserve banking.
All right. Okay. All right. We'll stop right there. Stop right there, because I think this is a good time to take a break, Charles. And and then you come back and relate the story of the Babylon Grain Bank and relate it to specifically the Federal Reserve and what's going on now. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great.
Okay, because I think it's very fascinating stuff. I'd never heard that before. That's really good stuff. Folks, we're talking with Charles Fuqua, Independence County Republican Chair. He gave this presentation probably in greater detail earlier this week in Independence County. All right, we got about 6.5 minutes left of this segment. I want to welcome back to the program former State Representative Charles Fuqua. He's also the chairman of the Independence County Republicans. Charles, thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Okay, I want to start off where I left off. And
real quick, Charles. Sorry to interrupt. We do have one person that, at least on our Facebook page, was like, "Hey, just give us a recap real quick." And so the recap is, "Hey, look, ancient Babylon had this grain bank, and they started, monkeying around with the numbers. It was the start of fractional reserve banking. It's immoral, it's unethical, and you can take it from there." How does that apply to the Federal Reserve System?
Okay, let me add one more thing. They issued receipts for grain, which were the money used in the economy. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Okay.
Now, I want to ask people two thought-provoking questions, and I want you to think about these. When the government deficit spends, does it get deeper in debt? And when I give this presentation, and I give it all over the state, and by the way, I'd be willing to give it anywhere to anybody who will listen, and actually in several other states too. When the government deficit spends, does it get deeper in debt? And when I ask that question, I see heads nodding all over the audience. Everybody says, yeah, that's true. Okay, question number two. When the government deficit spends, does it print money to cover the debt? And again, I see heads nodding up and down all over the audience. But now, wait a minute. I want you to just think about that. If you were deep in credit card debt, but you had the legal authority to go down in your basement and print money, couldn't you print enough money quickly and easily to get yourself out of debt? See, both of those statements cannot be true. And the one that is not true is that when the government deficit spends, it does not create the money. Our money supply is created by a privately owned entity known as the Federal Reserve Banking System. And the way it works is when the government deficit spends, the Federal Reserve creates money in exactly the same way the Babylonian grain banker did, out of nothing at no expense, and it loans that money to the government. The government can then pay its bills, and then the people are taxed to repay the money creators the money they created plus interest. Now, that's hard to believe for a lot of people, but if you just think about the reality of the situation, you'll know that has to be true. Not only is the United States deep in debt, $20 trillion as a matter of fact, but all the nations of the earth are deep in debt. Even China and Japan, and you know about all of Europe, how deep in debt that Europe is. But if all of these nations owe money, it has to be that that money is owed to someone. Well, the question is, who is that money owed to? And the answer to that question is that most of the nations of the earth have banking systems just like ours, and those debts are owed to those banking systems that are privately owned by international bankers. And the same international bankers own the money systems of all the nations of the earth. Now, I want to explain how money comes into existence in the United States. Again, it starts when the federal government deficit spends. It borrows money from the Fed. The Fed, this privately owned organization, creates the money, loans it to the government pays its bill. That money winds up in the hands of the people. The people then deposit that money in their local commercial bank. Now, the Babylonian banker had one level of money creation. In the United States, we have two levels of money creation. The first level is when the government borrows from the Fed. The second level is when the people borrow from the commercial bank. Mm-hmm. Okay? That money is deposited in checking accounts in commercial banks. And then according to the rules of fractional reserve banking, for every $10 deposited in the commercial bank, the banks can loan out $100. Now, where's that money come from that the banks loan out? We all think that when we go to a bank and borrow money, that the bank is loaning out savers' money. But I want you to just think about that for a minute. Nobody puts money in a savings account in a bank anymore. There's no money there. Because a savings account pays what? 0.1% interest? So there's no money. The only money in banks today is deposited in checking accounts. And if money is deposited in checking accounts, according to the rules of fractional reserve banking, the bank can loan out 10 times as much as what is deposited.
Wow.
By creating new money and loaning it into existence.
Charles,
right, we got to.
Yeah, I appreciate it, sir. That's all the time we have for today. I'd love to continue this discussion at another time. Maybe pick up where we left off. Pretty good stuff. I think it's educational. I think our audience has learned a lot. I appreciate it, Charles. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All righty, Charles Fuqua, everybody. We're going to be right back. We got a conservative future segment up next.